is Natalie Stettler. My major is political science, and my research interest is forced migration. The United Nations Human Rights Council defines forced migration as someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Forced migrants include refugees and internally displaced persons. Refugees are people who have been displaced and have crossed the international border, while IDPs are people who have been displaced but are still inside their home country. Now you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's awful, but why should it matter to me? Over the last 10 years, the number of forced migrants has more than doubled from 40 million to 80 million. Most of these refugees are still awaiting resettlement in camps because less than 1% are resettled into a third country. Once resettled into a third country, such as the United States, refugees face major challenges integrating into a new society. However, there is a massive gap in literature when it comes to understanding the integration of South Asian refugees integrating into the United States. And this is the focus of my research. The goal of this research is to identify factors that affect integration of resettled refugees into their new societies. Specifically, what explains why some South Asian refugees are integrating into American society successfully while others are not. Using the case of newly resettled Bhutanese refugees, my research analyzes the impact of demographic, socioeconomic, and political factors on the integration of refugees in Michigan. The first Nepali settlers in Bhutan appeared in early British colonial accounts in 1903. From there, a large community of Bhutanese Nepali quickly formed throughout southern Bhutan. In the early 20th century, and even today, most of the people in Bhutan are Buddhist and speak a Tibeto-Burman language. However, the Bhutanese Nepali maintained key aspects of their culture as they integrated into Bhutan. Unlike the native Bhutanese, most common language spoken among the Bhutanese Nepali is Nepali, and the most common religion is Hindu. Oops. Discriminatory practices against the Bhutanese Nepali began in the 1960s. Bhutanese Nepali were required to give both cash and labor as their tax instead of just labor like most of the citizens in the country. In 1988, the annual census in Bhutan began sorting Bhutanese Nepali into different categories and classifying some as non-nationals. This evolved into a method for the government of Bhutan to monitor and evict the Bhutanese population, the Bhutanese Nepali population. Soon after the implementation of census practices, the Driglam Namzu was established, which required the observation of a strict code regarding etiquette, belief, and the removal of Nepali teachings from schools. These laws essentially forbid the Bhutanese Nepali from practicing their Hindu beliefs in any way. Over time, Bhutan's discriminatory policies would lead to torture, false imprisonment, and even death for thousands of Bhutanese Nepali people. In 2015, the Panel on the Integration of Immigrants into American Society defined integration as a two-way process in which immigrants and their host societies come to resemble one another. In the same year, Rodriguez Garcia argued that integration is a contextual phenomenon generally viewed as a positive alternative to assimilation. Assimilation is a one-way process that requires newcomers to fully adopt their new country's culture and practices, while integration is a two-way process in which newcomers and natives adopt each other's cultures. "80,000 Bhutanese fled to Nepal in the early 1990s. By 2007, Nepal's refugee camps had a population of more than 100,000 displaced Bhutanese Nepalis. Between 2008 and 2016, 85,000 Bhutanese Nepalis were resettled across the United States. Around 2,100 Bhutanese Nepali refugees have been resettled across the state of Michigan. Since then, the Bhutanese Nepali population of Michigan has grown to over 17,000, mostly residing in Grand Rapids and Lansing. Resettled individuals' willingness to allow their child to marry an American is a true measure of integration into American society. While this may not be the most accurate measure of integration, we argue that refugees who support intermarriage with Americans are willing to accept American culture and feel that they belong to American society. Intermarriage across ethnic groups is a characteristic of American culture, but forbidden in many South Asian cultures, including the Bhutanese Nepali. Oh, okay, that's why I thought my slides were messed up. Okay. Based on my theory, I've developed some hypotheses. While not all resettled refugees might be willing to support intermarriage, those who came with a higher level of education or who sought an educational degree after being resettled into the United States are more likely to support intermarriage, which leads to my first hypothesis. Additionally, older generations are typically more traditional and have stronger cultural ties to their native country, which leads to my second hypothesis. Also, those with higher incomes tend to have more external contacts outside of their ethnic community, which leads to my third hypothesis. Resettled individuals who participated in the last presidential election are more likely to support intermarriage, as they are fulfilling a civic duty to the United States who supports intermarriage. This leads to my fourth hypothesis. Individuals who frequently interact with individuals from outside of their own community/culture are more likely to support intermarriage, as they have a more developed awareness of American people, which leads to my fifth hypothesis. And individuals who have arrived earlier and spent longer times in the United States are more likely to have been exposed to American culture, which leads to my sixth hypothesis. Data from my research comes from a survey conducted by my mentor, Dr. Prakash Adhikari, and his colleagues. The sample for the survey is 102 newly resettled former Bhutanese refugees currently living in the state of Michigan. The survey utilized both snowball and respondent-driven sampling. Snowball sampling relies on referrals from initially known subjects to find additional subjects. For this survey, the number of referrals was limited to reduce sample bias. Respondent-driven sampling was used to protect the identities of those who wish to remain anonymous due to stigmatization, as well as address the issues of inference and generalizability caused by snowball sampling. Dr. Adhikari and his team identified potential survey respondents using ties to the Bhutanese community of Michigan, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting former refugees living in the state of Michigan, as well as two VOLOGs, Bethany Christian Services, located in Grand Rapids, and St. Vincent Catholic Charities, located in Lansing. VOLOG stands for Voluntary Refugee Resettlement Agencies, who work to resettle refugees across the United States successfully. The first stage of survey administration began in January 2020. Trained enumerators conducted in-person surveys using paper and pencil. However, Dr. Adhikari was forced to stop interviews in March of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. The second stage of survey administration began in summer of 21. The survey was made available online using Qualtrics. Unfortunately, Dr. Adhikari and his research colleagues quickly discovered that a large percentage of the respondents were illiterate. To overcome this challenge, enumerators were trained to conduct the online survey in person. The data in my paper comes from the second phase of the survey, conducted in fall of 21 and spring of 22. The dependent variable integration in my research is a dichotomous measure of whether or not resettled refugees were willing to allow their child to marry someone of American nationality. Respondents were asked, would you allow your child to marry an American? A positive response is coded as 1, negative is 0. My independent variables are age, net annual income in US dollars, whether or not respondents voted in the last presidential election, social network, and year of resettlement in the United States. For the variable attitudes towards intermarriage, we had a total of 88 valid respondents. 36 respondents would not allow their child to marry an American, while 52 respondents would allow their child to marry an American. For the variable education prior to arrival to the United States, we had a total of 90 valid respondents. 25 respondents had received no formal education prior to arrival in the United States, while 65 respondents had received at least a kindergarten education prior to arrival in the United States. An independent t-test was conducted using a sample of 86 recently resettled former Bhutanese refugees to identify whether a statistically significant difference existed in average age upon arrival between those who would allow their child to marry an American and those who would not. The results show that respondents who would not allow their child to marry an American were of statistically significantly higher age upon arrival to the United States compared to those who would allow their child to marry an American. An independent t-test was run on a sample of 88 recently resettled former Bhutanese refugees to determine if there were differences in attitudes towards intermarriage based on whether or not they had received formal education prior to arrival in the United States. The results showed that respondents who would allow their child to marry an American had a statistically significantly higher frequency of formal education prior to arrival in the United States compared to participants who would not allow their child to marry an American. A chi-squared test was conducted using a sample of 88 recently resettled Bhutanese refugees to determine if there is a significant association between attitudes towards intermarriage and education prior to arrival in the United States. The results demonstrate that a statistically significant association does exist, and here's what that looks like. Those who do support intermarriage tended to have at least some formal education upon arrival, while those who do not support intermarriage tended to have no formal education upon arrival. A chi-squared test was conducted using a sample of 88 recently resettled Bhutanese refugees to determine if a significant association exists between attitudes towards intermarriage and higher education. The results demonstrate that a significant association does exist. And here's what that looks like. Those with higher education are much more likely to support intermarriage. Findings from my research are expected to better inform the public as well as policymakers about why some resettled refugees integrate while others do not. It is my hope that my findings will encourage policymakers to make improvements to local, state, and federal integration processes in the United States for the over 80 million refugees still waiting in camps. These are my references. I would like to thank my family, the McNair program, and the Bhutanese communities of Michigan for making this project possible. I am also incredibly grateful for the contributions of my mentor and research advisor, Dr. Prakash Adhikari, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.